In the fields of psychology, critical race theory, and media analysis, we can see how political decisions and rhetoric alter what we call the threshold of acceptability for racism in our society by providing a mechanism for normalization and legitimization of that racism. And this weekend, we actually saw the outcomes of that happen in two really different ways. We saw the media, again, downplay Winston's racist rhetoric at his speech to focus on a policy that experts say make no sense. Again, but sounds like a 40-year-old vendetta that he wants to get even for before he meets his maker. Again. And we saw white supremacists stand outside an MP's office and demand to be taken seriously as they use the same rhetoric that we see on reality check radio and the Christchurch Terrorists Manifesto. These changes happen in a variety of ways, like a language change that moves from overt racism to covert racism by hiding intent behind what seems like neutral language. We have data that points out that an increase in targeted anti-Māori racism surges dramatically when political figures in positions of authority target Māori in policies as something to vilify, because the language used is seen as a hidden signal to racists, and data that shows an increase in anti-Māori racism here is a signal that any minority is an acceptable target for those awful people who hear dog whistles really loudly, usually while spouting some kind of bullshit on Twitter. On top of that, we are seeing an increase in this rhetoric from Australia. As hate speech laws are tightened there, our lax laws, similar cultural backgrounds and shared pipelines for extremist behaviours is a concern for security analysts, criminologists, and digital hate and disinformation monitors, because these groups specifically seek out jurisdictions that have fewer legal barriers to operate in, host content in, or recruit from. So, when Australia stomps down hard, we're seen as the soft spot for these groups to move to, especially after regulation against this is publicly removed, like the end of the Broadcasting Standards Authority. So, why are we now seeing an increase in this kind of rhetoric and its normalisation? Some of this rhetoric actually led to our most tragic moment as a country, and we're still seeing it normalised, and that's because the coalition has normalised it. Now, some MPs will argue that it's other parties and they've opposed it, but that ignores the fact that they did enable it to happen. Nicola Willis might be upset at Shane Jones for making racist comments, but in that same speech she said she'd still work with him because they're mates.
That is my friends in New Zealand first.
But they're not isolated incidents. I can think of at least 25 times that this kind of action has happened that normalises this kind of behaviour for the worst people in the country. You know, like the introduction of the Treaty Principles Bill. ACT leader David Seymour championed a bill to redefine the principles of the Treaty of Waitangi. Although New Zealand First and National both stated they're not going to support it past Select Committee, critics argue that allowing the bill to be introduced legitimised anti-treaty and anti-Māori settlements under the guise of equal rights. There was the disestablishment of Te Aka Whai Ora, or the Māori Health Authority. One of the government's first major actions was using urgency to scrap the Māori Health Authority. And opponents argue that dismantling an agency explicitly designed to address severe, documented structural health inequities downplayed the reality of institutional racism in healthcare. There was the repeal of Section 7AA of the Oranga Tamariki Act. The government moved to remove the statutory obligation for the state care provider to prioritise cultural and iwi connections for Māori children. The Waitangi Tribunal strongly criticised the move, with opponents stating that it emboldens assimilationist mindsets amongst voters. There's forcing referendums on the local Māori wards. The coalition reinstated the law requiring councils to hold binding local referendums on existing or proposed Māori wards. Critics contended that subjecting minority representation to a majority vote naturally invites racially charged local campaigns, especially since other ward structures were not included. There's the overturning of the Marine and Coastal Area Act judgments. Following court rulings that lowered the threshold for Māori customary marine titles, the government introduced the Takutai Moana Amendment Bill to intentionally raise the legal bar back up. Critics view this as overriding judicial independent findings to appease a voter base who are anxious over Māori customary rights. Well, you know, racist enough to spend a shit ton of money to put covers out on the Herald to say that they just don't like it. There's the scorched earth approach to Section 27 reports, the government/legal aid funding for Section 27 cultural background reports used in sentencing. Opponents have argued that this downplays the systemic, socio-economic and generational factors that disproportionately affect Māori and Pacific defendants. And Paul Goldsmith said, yeah, that's actually what's going to happen and there's nothing you can do about it. There was the scrapping of the National Action Plan Against Racism. The Ministry of Justice work program towards establishing a National Action Plan Against Racism, or NAPA, was halted and deprioritised under the Coalition's broader directive to roll back race-based initiatives, which signals to critics that addressing racism was no longer a government priority. There were the directives on the use of te reo Māori in the public sector. The government issued official directives requiring public service departments to use English as their primary language and name, rolling back the bilingual naming conventions of government agencies. Critics have argued that this devalues the status of the Indigenous language to satisfy a voter base hostile to te reo Māori, or scared by another language. There was stripping treaty obligations from the Education Act. The Coalition pursued amendments to strip explicit Treaty of Waitangi obligations from Section 127 of the Education and Training Act. The Waitangi Tribunal issued a scathing report finding that move specifically systemically targeted Māori educational protections. There's financial penalties for public servants learning te reo Māori. The government targeted financial incentives and bonuses given to public sector workers for proficiency in te reo Māori. Opponents argued that characterising language upskilling as an unnecessary waste emboldened public hostility towards cultural integration. There's scrapping of hate speech legislation, which admittedly was downplayed a bit when Chris Hipkins was in charge, but the Coalition permanently shelved proposed hate speech legislation designed to expand protections for religious and ethnic minorities following the Christchurch mosque attacks, framing it as a defence of free speech. A move that critics say signalled comfort with unchecked hostile rhetoric, which we saw this weekend. Shane Jones's butter chicken tsunami comment. In opposing a free trade agreement with India, Shane Jones warned of the butter chicken tsunami on a disinformation spreading network, all about unfettered immigration. Finance Minister Nicola Willis called it race-based scaremongering, while opposition leaders pointed it as a textbook example of using xenophobic tropes to rally voters. There was David Seymour's character of New Zealand comments. During debates on high immigration numbers, ACT leader David Seymour publicly commented that mass migration risked altering the character of New Zealand forever. Critics highlight this as a hell of a dog whistle targeting migrant communities to stoke demographic anxiety, and looking at the comment sections, his followers heard that. Winston Peters' State of the Nation Nazi analogy. You remember in a high-profile speech when he was Deputy Prime Minister, Winston Peters compared elements of the previous government's co-governance policies to Nazi Germany and racial supremacy. Despite widespread condemnation from the Holocaust Centre of New Zealand, Winston Peters has refused to retract that statement. There was Winston Peters questioning the indigeneity of Māori. In parliamentary and public debates, Winston Peters has asserted that Māori are not indigenous to New Zealand because they migrated here from Hawaii, a stance widely rejected by historians and legal frameworks, but utilised to undermine constitutional status of tangata whenua. There was the dismissal of the UN Special Rapporteur. Following a critical brief from the UN Special Rapporteur on Indigenous peoples regarding this government's policies, David Seymour responded with open hostility, telling the UN official to mind their own business. Critics note that this signalled to the voter base that international human rights standards regarding racism can just be ignored. There was the characterisation of co-governance as apartheid. Throughout the election and subsequent governance, coalition MPs have frequently used the term apartheid to describe co-governance arrangements in water infrastructure and environmental management, a comparison that critics argue minimises the true historical atrocities to inflame racial resentment. There was the accepting of donations from anti-co-governance figures. The coalition parties have faced intense scrutiny for accepting significant political donations from individuals and lobby groups explicitly aligned with anti-treaty, anti-co-governance platforms. Refusing to distance themselves from these donors is viewed by critics as an implicit endorsement of their views. There was also the elevation of Hobson's Pledge rhetoric. Even though Hobson's Pledge is an external lobby group, its core messaging against Māori favouritism mirrors the policy platforms of both ACT and New Zealand First, and some within National. Critics have noted that the coalition MPs frequently amplify, validate, or speak at events sharing the group's literature, normalising the anti-bicultural narrative, and a member of their board is an MP for New Zealand First. There's Fast Track Approvals Bill and iwi customary input. The introduction of the Fast Track Approvals Bill actually concentrated immense power in a small group of ministers, bypassing standard environmental consults, including targeted iwi consultation. Critics argue that this eroded the principles of partnership, signalling that Indigenous environmental stewardship is a barrier somehow to progress. There was the targeting gangs using racially disproportionate measures. The government heavily promoted anti-gang legislation like gang patch bans and dispersal notices. Has been criticised by criminal justice advocates who argue that the laws are inevitably applied disproportionately to Māori and Pacific youth, feeding on a tough-on-crime narrative that exploits racial stereotypes, like what people are doing in their garages in South Auckland, as the Prime Minister put it. There was the halting of the implementation of the United Nations He Puapua report. The government formally halted all work related to He Puapua, which is just a report on realising the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and declared the declaration had no legal binding status in New Zealand. It never did. Opponents state that framing a human rights framework as a secret separatist agenda stokes voters with conspiracy theories. There was the overriding of the local democratic zoning in favour of anti-Māori rhetoric. In several regional disputes regarding co-management of natural resources like lakes and rivers, ministers have sided against local bipartisan agreements to fulfill coalition promises to strip Māori from decision-making tables, proving a willingness to override local cooperation to satisfy ideological voter demands. There's characterising the hikoi as divisive. When the largest ever modern hikoi arrived at Parliament to protest government race relation policies, senior coalition figures dismissed the protesters as a loud minority or labelled the display of Māori unity as inherently divisive to New Zealand's social fabric and completely ignoring their own element of having caused the need for the hikoi. There's also the standardising universalism to deny systemic biases. Across various public forums, the Prime Minister has defended the removal of targeted Māori and Pacifica funding in education, health and small business by asserting a philosophy of need, not race. Now, critics have argued that by erasing the specific ethnic identities attached to systemic disadvantages, the government validates the voter belief that targeted funding equals reverse racism, which isn't a thing. So, when an MP from National or anyone in the coalition finger points and says the rise of racism is because of someone else, remember that they're in a coalition, okay? They work together, they enable each other. They might not like hearing someone talk about butter chicken tsunamis, but it was the Prime Minister whose acceptance that he was going to work with New Zealand First publicly in 2023 that actually gave them the surge to end up over that threshold in the first place. And as long as the people making the decisions keep saying stuff like this and aren't held to account, then we're going to continue to see a rise in racism. And we've seen firsthand the extreme outcomes that can lead to. And I've been in rooms where I've watched National MPs nod and wink at audiences.
Therefore, they have a separate framework from our one vote, one person. That's the answer. And that's why.
Literally, as they talk about being against co-governance as a way to keep Māori quiet. I've watched speeches in the House where National Party MPs have celebrated stopping Māori voices. So it's clearly not just a viewpoint that National has enabled in others. There's many in their own caucus who share the views, make the noise, and open the floodgates for extremists to think they can protest and anyone would actually take them seriously. Because when you make it okay to target one group, you make it okay to target any group. Oh, hey there, podcast listeners. Thanks for checking out today's podcast, whether that's on video or audio. I really appreciate it. And I did finally get around to doing a podcast end tag, which I've been meaning to do for a while instead of just taking you onto the Facebook version. So while you're here, why not hit that subscribe button so that you can get updates coming in directly every time there's a new episode uploaded. Just seems like a really simple way to keep up to date with all of the crazy that's going on. So yeah, give that a shot and I'll talk to you soon.